Wow, you quieted down fast. That's awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Fourcher. I am one of the 3 founders of Aldertrack, and I want to thank you all very much for coming to our first anniversary celebration. So give us a round of applause, please. I'm very excited about tonight. We're going to have a lot of really great things that I'm going to tell you about. But first, I want to thank our sponsors that are here and help to make this happen tonight, including one of them is doing a fist pump. That's awesome. Thanks. One of our top sponsors is Reyes Curson, and I want to thank the whole team from Reyes Curson, including Victor Reyes. Thank you very much for your sponsorship. The Chicago Association of Realtors, as well as WGN Radio, who is going to be recording this tonight, that we're making into a podcast, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, as well as Daly and George's outreach experts, who is responsible for putting this together today, the Sexton Group, the Illinois Health and Hospital Association, Uber, K&I Communications, the Architectural Institute of America, Chicago, and the Haymarket Pub and Brewery. We're really grateful to all of you for your sponsorship today. So welcome. I'm going to do this fast introduction because I know we want to get to the panels, which is the interesting stuff. It's our anniversary. I think we already did that one. So we started with just two guys. Myself and Jim Dispenza. Jim is actually the one who really started this long ago in 2007 as a typepad website. And then we did something again with a group that's no longer operating anymore, the Chicago News Cooperative. But then back in August of 2014, Jim said, hey, let's do this. Let's do this again. We'll just make this PDF and we'll see if anybody's really interested in having good, high-quality information on what's happening in elections. So we had this thing, the racing form. And we said, okay, give us $10 if you like it. And then we'll send you a new one every day. And you know what? Over 900 people liked it. That was really something. And so this got really popular, and it grew and grew and grew, and then one day we asked you, hey, would you be interested in having a year-round report? And enough of you said yes, so that we became a company. And it's actually kind of amazing. I still can't believe that we have had the privilege of doing what we do for you every weekday and sometimes weekends. Jim, Edie Quigg, myself, Ramsden Cannon, Claudia Morell, and Scott Kennedy, with the exception of Ramsden, who's he's not feeling well tonight. They're all here tonight, so if you have a chance to say hello to them, please do. This is a really tight-knit group. We have a lot of fun together, and we love to hear from you, too. We actually ended up getting Best of Chicago from the Chicago Reader, which was pretty exciting. I don't know if you knew about that. We think that we already knew we were the best of Chicago, but it's nice to have somebody tell us that. And then we've done a lot of other things. We've broken some news. We did the racing form again, which I think a lot of you subscribed to again. We most recently had our first in-depth special report on police reform a couple weeks ago, which I think had a lot of impact. So we're planning to do all of those things more, so watch for this. And coming in June, we're going to have a new website, which is going to allow subscriber access to articles, the ability to share articles, and searchable archives. So all the things that we've written in the past, you'll be able to search by name, by company, all those fun things, in order to see what we've written about and things that we've covered in all the city council and city politics stuff. And we're going to start having a monthly subscription option, which we're also really excited about. We've heard from lots and lots of people that they want a monthly subscription option, and now we're going to be able to do that. So without any further ado, we're going to go to the stuff that's interesting and fun. We're going to start with our first panel discussion, and I'm going to move over here and sit down. First, I want to introduce Marisa Novara. Can you come on up and take a seat? Director at the Metropolitan Planning Council since 2011, Marisa Novara heads up MPC's housing and community development work. She's also a rare and masochistic breed, a double master's. one from University of Chicago's School of Social Services Administration, and a second in urban planning from the, all right, I'm going to do some Italian here, Istituto Politecnico di Milano.
Bravissima.
Yeah, okay. Bueno. She polished her Chicago cred by running affordable housing development for the Lawndale Christian Development Corporation. Next is Richard Wilson. Come on up, Richard. An urban planner for Smith-Gill Architects. Richard Wilson's global practice includes award-winning work throughout North America, the Middle East, China, and India. He headed up the Beijing Central Business District Eastern Expansion Plan, the JP City Master Plan in India, and locally, the Chicago Central Area Action Plan for downtown Chicago. Rob Paral is a demographer. Come on up, Rob. And founder of Rob Paral and Associates, a consulting firm that helps philanthropic foundations, service organizations, and government agencies that understand the communities they serve through applied research methods. In particular, he's researched immigration patterns for the Latino Institute in Chicago, as well as a number of other universities and institutions. So our group here today is going to address, is Chicago shrinking? And we have something interesting. There is a app that you can use with your phone if you go to thumbs.aldertrack.com, and you can submit questions that you might have, and you can upvote ones that you like or don't like, and then I get them on my iPad here. And so then I can ask the questions of the panelists as we go along. So we're pretty interested to hear what you have to say. Thumbs.aldertrack.com, and there's the Wi-Fi password. So why don't we start off? I'm going to come back to this slide in case you miss it. Rob, you're going to do a quick introduction.
Okay. I'll do
and also, each of you, as you speak, we're recording this, so try and speak directly into the microphone, pull it close to you if you need to, so that we record it correctly.
Okay, please indicate to me if my voice is getting picked up on the microphone. Does that sound good? Okay, a little closer? A little closer? Is that a little closer? How's that? A little better? All right, thank you very much. Well, all right. Well, happy birthday, Aldertrack. And thanks for the chance to be here with you. Yeah. And to Mike for having me here and my friend Jim Dispenza. I'm happy to be here with them, but also with a bunch of smart people who can talk about Chicago and its demographics and the neighborhoods we love. I'm going to run by just a number of kind of blippy, pointy things with you about population change, because our question is whether Chicago is shrinking. So the first thing, let's answer that right away. Chicago's been shrinking for a long time, everybody. The population peak of this city was what decade? It was 1950, and we crammed another 900,000 people into this city, okay? So it's nothing new about whether population is declining in Chicago. It has had some blips along the way we could talk about, and why it went up in the 90s. It went, had an increase. I want to share a couple other quick points and then give my colleagues here a chance to talk. So this topic of population change, if you could imagine the Midwest in your mind, a mental map of it right now, and the Plains states, and the whole northeastern part of the United States, and just imagine all the counties that fit into all those states, almost every single one of them is losing population. It's an amazing fact in the United States that the center, north, and northeast is in population decline in all these, especially rural areas. And then you have these islands of growth. So population decline is going on in a big way in the United States. The only reason it grows in some of the southern and western states really is because of the movement of people from here to those areas, okay? If you looked at a map of Chicago, the 6 counties, and looked at the townships and suburbs that make up the metropolitan Chicago region, this mental map in your mind, it would be the same thing. Almost every single geographic part of this great metropolitan area is losing population, okay? So it's really going on. But just like I said, there were these islands of growth in the Midwest and Northeast, be it Ann Arbor, or be it Indianapolis, or be it Minneapolis, for example. Same thing in Metro Chicago. You have these booming growth areas, as a lot of you are familiar with, kind of pretty much where we are right now, right? And if my arm was an arm of about a mile long, maybe a little more than a mile at this point, right? If my arm were 1.5 miles, 2 miles long, I could swing it, right? And just cover an absolutely enormous area of population growth. The fastest growing percentage-wise and numerical census tracts in the Midwest are the ones right around Circle Campus there, okay? So I don't want to take too much more time. I want to make a couple points with you about the city of Chicago. Let's just kind of tick off the major groups and what's going on with them. So I told you the city had its population peak in 1950. Well, so did the white population, right? It's been basically in decline numerically for a long time now. But you know, it's just possible that the corner has been turned. There's some early returns from the Census Bureau that show that since the last decade, there may actually be an increase here. Why would that happen? It's because the growth in my arm's reach that I just did here is finally starting to overtake the decline in the northwest and southwest sides where you had all that aging and change of the white ethnic population. So so you might have white population growth in Chicago, although for very different reasons than you used to have, and a very different kind of individual, okay? African Americans, the most amazing demographic change going in Chicago right now. How many cities epitomize the Great Migration more than Chicago, right? So a city that lost 17%, 1 out of 6 African Americans in the last decade, is really a dramatic change going on. And since the end of the last decade, 2010, we've lost another 30,000 blacks from the city of Chicago, okay? I got real interested in this the other day. I'm not gonna talk too much longer, but I just started to wonder, well, when was the black population peak in Chicago and its neighborhoods? And I mapped this out. And guess what? We should put aside these notions of everyone suddenly running away because of the gun violence and things like that. The black population peaks throughout the whole entire South and West Side traditional black neighborhoods was 1980, okay? So there's a factoid. My last group that I want to mention is Latinos. Basically, because of the white and black population departure from Chicago, this city has ridden on the back of the Latino population to keep its numbers up. And there's a couple really interesting facts about that. We had that boom in the 90s. The population grew in the city. Trust me on that. It actually had an increase. It was the only decade since 1950 that did. It was all because of immigration. And no other city in the United States depended as much on immigration as Chicago did depend on immigration. No other one had as much of its growth depending on immigration. And the little secret behind all of that, by the way, it wasn't just immigration, it was Latino immigration specifically. And it was not just Latino immigration specifically. The boom in the 90s was basically undocumented immigration from Mexico. No other city depended on it and received as much as Chicago did proportionately. So these are some of the major things going on. We could talk so much. The Asians, we really owe a lot to the Asian population now because they're our fastest growing group pretty much. Unfortunately, disproportionately, they live in the suburbs, by the way. All right? The Indian population, 3/4 of it lives in suburban Cook County. So these are some of the kind of major shifts going on. I'd be happy to talk about that in a little more detail after my other colleagues talk with you. We could talk a little bit more about neighborhoods. My gosh, what are some of the changes across those groups within the city?
Rob, I want to ask Richard and Marisa to jump in. What is the relevance of these changes? I mean, what does that mean for the city in terms of its makeup, and what can we expect just broadly from your experience? That's a really big question. I mean, what changes? You've studied other cities as well as Chicago, and when you have these kind of changes of makeup of population and also numbers, what are the sort of things that begin to happen in the future?
Well, one thing that I think is really important about the kind of work that Rob does is that demography is such an important part of how we plan for cities. So I took a look last year when numbers came out that, just as we saw this year, huge growth in and around the central business district, but the one other part of the city where there was any growth at all was actually a cluster of about 7 community areas right near Midway Airport. And what was very interesting, I went out and met with a school principal, I went out and met with some community leaders there to talk about it, and they were saying over and over that there's been a huge influx of people moving from Pilsen Little Village and moving directly from other places who are Latino, but the services had not followed. And so they were traveling back to Pilsen for language classes or back to Pilsen for other things because those services had not come with them. And same with daycare and same with overcrowded schools and so on. So the importance of really being able to pay attention to where people are moving and what are the things that they need, particularly when you have areas that are growing in a place where a lot of our city is not growing, we want to be able to catch that and respond to it as soon as possible.
Okay. Richard, do you have any insight on this in terms of other cities?
Well, thank you for inviting me today. And I'm an architect, so I usually talk to pictures and graphs and the like, so to have an open mic and to talk is kind of a different kind of experience. So thank you.
Can you pull your mic a little closer, by the way?
And I'll pull the mic closer. And so in my practice, really looking at the physical kind of construct, the bones of community and of a city, it was very interesting to have this kind of leading question of, is Chicago shrinking? And is that a bad thing? So, in terms of practice, what are the questions that my clients are asking and what kind of challenges are the cities facing? We really do see major workplace shifts that I think is a huge story. Of course, the 1950s, the out-migration to suburbs was a big story. I think there was another big story around the 80s when we started to relocate corporate office outside of our cities. It was easy to still live in the city, but drive, easy 30-minute commute, life was good. But the story today really focuses around congestion, our ability to move as a region, and consequently, an easy trip now is an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so more and more, our transportation network, the way that we're able to move throughout the region, I think is largely driving locational decisions back into our cities. And in addition to that, there's a huge cultural shift, as supported by the numbers I think you just said, that we have large numbers of baby boomers that are meeting retirement age, they're moving to Sunbelt cities. I think that could explain a large shift in the numbers that were just out. But married with that are lifestyle expectations of our millennial generation that want to be in city centers. 4 out of 5 out of our top 10 cities are surveyed as kind of a sample group, talk about transit, access, the ability to be in a great city without transportation. The on-demand anything kind of market is what they're really looking for. So I think as a city, we really have to think about where we are, but what kind of investments in infrastructure do we need to accommodate the lifestyle decisions of the people that we want to keep and to attract.
So transportation, infrastructure in particular, transportation is a big thing. Both of you have mentioned. I'm curious, is it looking at other cities or how shrinking occurs, does that affect a city's ability to address infrastructure? Are we heading into a slippery slope? Is there some sort of inflection point that usually occurs for cities that you have to get worried about?
Well, I think cities that are growing are investing in their transit infrastructure and are investing in development around their transit. And that's something we've seen in the Chicago region, that increasingly we are growing further and further away from transit, and that's not a positive trend.
So what are some examples how we're growing away from transit?
Well, we see, I don't have my visuals, but when you look at where job centers that are not in the central business district, they're increasingly, we see people that are further than the quarter mile needed, generally speaking, to be considered a transit station to be walkable. And if you're talking about increased suburban employment nodes, then you have a much harder time even imagining going from suburb to suburb for employment.
I mean, are you able to, but is there, to ask the question again before, is there an inflection point where this stuff becomes a particular problem of a size of a city?
Absolutely. I've worked with Detroit a number of years trying to pick up the pieces there. That's a city that's lost 60%. I want to talk about a shrinking city. They have infrastructure kind of cost demands to upkeep with about 50%, 40% of the people, tax and income, they need to keep that. So that's kind of a crisis mode. I don't feel that Chicago certainly is in a crisis mode. I think we're at a very interesting opportunity in our growth to think about next generation connections. So what does that mean? You can't build yourself out of congestion. I don't believe we can't build more roads, more streets, more capacity. I think that just makes things worse. So as a mature city, I think we're at a point where we can start to look at what I'm calling kind of off-street connections in infrastructure. So needed infrastructure that provides multiple kind of addresses a multitude of needs. So things like the Riverwalk to provide new ways to move from our regional train to office, residential, entertainment places, the 606 as a repurposed piece of infrastructure off-street where people can move into what we believe is going to be a major growing employment center along our repurposed industrial corridors. Projects like the Paseo in Little Village, for example, you're starting to see these kind of off-road connectors deep into our neighborhood. So I think those are the things, the kind of investment that people can get excited about. And it's really interesting. You know, you mentioned that I work in some kind of strange and crazy places around the world. And I tell you, the first 20 years of practice, I would come back, we'd talk about major China investments in high-speed rail. They just decided, they just did it. Look what followed that. And other things, and people would just look at me, they would yawn, they would say, well, what does that have to do with America? It's like we had a disconnect, and it's because we made major investments in infrastructure 50, 60, 70 years ago, whereas many of these new emergent places are making those first-time investments now. I think the huge shift that I'm seeing over the past 5, 6 years is that people are very interested in Chicago and in cities in America about what is being kind of tried and practiced around the world to build new, very high-performance urban districts, neighborhoods, and really live kind of in harmony and with great stewardship of the earth. I think it's a different conversation. It's a very exciting time to be in city design.
So we've got. We're getting a lot of questions from people, which is amazing. I don't know if you guys can see this, but we've got all these questions that are coming up here. And we've had 12 upvotes for one question, which is, North Side communities are growing and adding population, while South Side and West Side communities are shrinking. What can we do to address that growth? And how can we help those communities grow? And Rob, I'm wondering if you can say something about that. It looks like maybe you can.
Actually, myth number one, we're going to bust about that North Side communities are growing. Over the last decade, there were only, I think two community areas grew in population over the last decade. And when I'm talking public, I can't remember anything, and my head is a sieve to begin with. But on the far southwest side, there's one community area growing, and then the Loop, of course, as I said, my arm swing. So even the myth of the North Side being super, prosperous or something is not exactly true. But having said that, I want to make one other quick comment, which is that in this era of aging and some population decline, it doesn't mean that the whole story is a negative story. And I don't want to be up here saying like the sky is falling because our city's losing population. It's so much more complex than that. Within the North Side, you have areas that are, doing very well, where the ratio of the median income to the lowest incomes in Chicago is higher than it ever was before. And you also have areas on the South Side that are just undergoing amazing transformation. I mentioned earlier in my talk all that building that went around Halsted, south of Circle Campus, tens of thousands of people living there. Have you been to Pilsen lately? Did you know that 30% of the population north of 18th Street is not Latino anymore? And then I have two other quick prognoses. I think if I really had to guess, and I have no basis other than instinct on this, that the Garfield parks will grow. They are destined to grow. And there's one other, which is I think the most tenuous idea I have. I wish I had the data, but I would just bet you that Oakland and Douglas and those lakeside community areas south of the Loop will become increasingly developed over time. And so within the story of population decline, is it happening north side, south side? It's more complex. It's on the south side as well, but it's in certain pockets, isn't it?
Can you address that?
Yeah, I also maybe to add a little nuance to what I think is behind the question. We just released today a series of blog posts looking into the middle class in Chicago and kind of pulling that apart by race. And I think it adds some background to the gist of the question, which is like, how is the city experienced differently by different kinds of people, depending on your race and depending on where you live? And we found some very, very interesting things. In the middle class census tracts, more than 60% of the population are people of color, which sounds really great. But when you look a little deeper, we see a very different experience. We found that census tracts that were majority white were mainly north side, mainly more diverse, and the tracts around them that were not middle class because they were higher income. So there was kind of a buffer zone around them of higher income population. When we looked at census tracts where the majority of folks were African American or Latino, we found that those were much more segregated experiences. Almost everyone in an area was only African American, only Latino. And the neighborhoods, and it was mostly South and West Side, and the neighborhoods surrounding them that were not middle class were lower income. And so, the reporter, for instance, just did a recent piece on this, on Kenwood, on the experience of being in the black middle class in Kenwood, and kind of a black tax that goes with that, that although you may personally be in the middle class, your home value is lower, poverty and crime is higher than your white counterparts in other parts of the city. So what does this have to do with growth? Well, I think it has a lot to do with why people are leaving. As Rob mentioned, we lost 177,000 African Americans between 2000 and 2014, and 2000 and 2010. And when we looked at middle class census tracts, we saw from 2000 to 2014 a 41% loss of the black population in middle class tracts. So to put that in real numbers, that was from over 700,000 people to less than 425,000 people. It's like losing the entire city of Aurora plus some. And in perspective, white population in those middle class tracts dropped 12%, Latino 2%, and Asians grew almost 10%. So one last point on this. I'm sure you all heard of the recent poll that the New York Times and the Kaiser Family Foundation did, asking Chicagoans to sort of talk about their experience living in the city. And there was some real convergence around concerns about the direction of the city, but then there also was a really sharp divide based on race, and just a couple points on that. Response to the question, how would you rate your neighborhood as a place to raise children? 44% of black respondents said their neighborhood was a poor place to raise children. Just 16% of white Chicagoans did. 49% of black Chicagoans said it was likely that a young person in their neighborhood would be a victim of violent crime. Under 20% of whites did. And blacks and Latinos were far more likely to say they wanted to get out of their neighborhoods and out of Chicago, period. And as it turns out, they already are. And I think that what the poll shows us is that for African Americans in particular have a profoundly different experience of living in this city than others do, and particularly than white people do.
Richard, can you address a little bit about what can be done to grow some of these communities?
Well, some things I hear on the street, we start to talk about the downtown has gotten everything, that's where all the action is, nothing's happening in the neighborhood, but we know that we have great, rich, diverse neighborhoods, and there's action all over the city. We also recognize that downtown is the large employment center of the Midwest. It's essential we continue to invest, we do good, we do jobs, but here's the huge story, I think, and it raises some very interesting policy questions that I think we are all going to be grappling with for the next 5 or 10 years. Office demand in downtown, the story used to be legal and financial. Well, those sectors are contracting. The big headlines we read every day is about tech growth. 275 startups a year, $3 billion in venture capital in a 4-year period, 80,000 tech jobs. Where will these tech people come from and fill this pool? I mean, there is a war for this. So what's very interesting is many of those kind of growing sectors aren't quite as interested in being in a traditional office building. They like these fringe edges that are interesting, kind of creative and cool. So now we're starting to see demand in some of our old industrial areas. And lo and behold, the 3 that are probably most in play are the 3 that physically connect to the central area. So we know a lot about in Fulton Market, but there's been a lot in the press about the North Branch River and the like. So why do I say all of that? I think there's induced demand here that we're going to have to solve and figure out. I think the way to unlock that value, frankly, is going to be finding ways to make that last half-mile connection between CTA stations, metro stations, over to these industrial areas that were traditionally kind of isolated. And to the neighborhoods, I think the issue is if there's this great value in this kind of change of use in these corridors, some of those businesses are going to be not driven out, but choose to locate in different locales. And I think that's the big opportunity. How can we build on our strength in this demand? How can we imagine as a civil society a way to kind of structure, fund, and seed employment, jobs, industry in some of our west, south, and north suburbs, and really tie that with investments in STEM school and job development. So you can't solve everything at once, but I think with concerted effort and building on our strengths, I'm very upbeat that we as Chicagoans can make some good decisions.
So I'm going to interrupt you because we got a bunch of questions here. I know. So one of the big questions that everyone seems to be asking is, can we encourage growth in our neighborhoods without pricing out existing residents? Do you want to answer that, Marisa?
Sure.
Or you want to take a pass?
No, I do want to answer that. I think that's a great question, and it's an appropriate concern. I also think that we need to be aware of the frequency in which the gentrification term actually applies in Chicago, and versus how much it gets talked about. And Voorhees Center did a study in 2014 that looked back at neighborhoods since 1970 and found that since 1970. 9 neighborhoods had or were in the process of gentrifying, whereas since 1970, the number of neighborhoods in concentrated poverty had gone from 29 to 40. So I just want to keep that proportion in mind when we talk about the concern, which there are a handful of neighborhoods for whom this is a very real concern, but it is just a handful of neighborhoods. So how can we encourage growth is the other piece of the question. How do we encourage growth in neighborhoods where that's not happening now? I was just in Denver last week for a housing conference, and it was very interesting to be in a place where everything's coming up roses. I mean, this place has grown 1 million people since the mid-'90s. And
Cannabis, not roses.
That was only the last 2 years. And the main things they had to, as concerns, were that housing costs and traffic are through the roof, right? As a place that's grown so rapidly. But the other thing, with so much incredible growth and so much development, as I asked about kind of harnessing some of that growth for on-site affordability, wearing my housing hat, the impression I came away with was that there was a certain timidity, a kind of fear about rocking the boat of all the upward trajectory that was happening, and that there really wasn't much of a public push to do so. And then it really made me reflect and wonder if, I don't have to tell anyone here that this is a difficult time for Chicago. It's not just population loss. We have state and local budget woes. We have police community relations in crisis. We have headlines about violent crime. We have young black men, nearly 50% out of work and out of school. It's a hard time, and I wonder if with some of those challenges comes the opportunity to really be bold, and the mandate, actually, to be bold that might not be there otherwise if everything were going well. And so I'll give you a specific example. Last week, City Council passed an ordinance that expanded the downtown density and raised some fees and decided to do something creative with it. Who knows, maybe a couple years ago they might have stopped at expanding the downtown district and raising the fees. But what happened last week was they determined that 80% of those fees would go into neighborhoods where there's a significant amount of market failure, and that those fees would go into economic development in areas where there's a lack of private investment. So to me, that is a city that's not afraid to leverage. And sometimes that comes from a boldness that's required in difficult times. So my question, as an organization that's working on a study on what segregation costs our region, is are we, we created segregation, and are we in a phase now that we can be bold enough to deconstruct it?
Richard, are there any lessons learned that we can take from other cities to ensure that the gentrification doesn't take over, or that neighborhoods can retain their original character?
Well,
and can you move a little closer to your microphone, too?
Well, I really appreciate what you were saying, because I think time and time what the numbers are suggesting, that gentrification isn't necessarily the issue. It's certainly the buzzword. It's systemic poverty that's the issue. And so, the numbers that we've seen is that in poor or in troubled neighborhoods, when people have the ability finally to get out, they are getting out. So that leaves those still there, and it just compounds the matter even worse. Then you start to overlay things like access to transit, to school, to jobs and the likes, and it just gets more mired. So it's a very, very complicated, issue to take on.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
don't have the answer.
No,
If I
that's
had
cool.
the answer, that's my answer. But I do want to say one more thing. I am so proud to be in the city of Chicago, because in my 20 years working here, I've worked in 14 different neighborhoods with different organizations. I was thrilled to hear your background. There is the infrastructure out there to do good. Things are happening in our neighborhoods. And unlike some cities I've been in where there's just a spirit, too bad, I don't want to hear it, I've never heard anyone raise an issue here in Chicago, ask for help, or put forward a need that we couldn't figure out a way to rally around and do something about it. So my spirit is upbeat, even if I don't have all the answers yet. I'm ready to do the work, and that's my final.
Okay. That's a great point. And yay, I feel good too. I love Chicago. And I don't mean that sarcastically. I moved back here. I lived somewhere else for 15 years. I want to ask Rob, can you address a little bit about how immigration has boomed for a period, and now maybe it's not quite as much, and Chicago relied on immigration for a long time for growth. Are we doing something wrong? Is there something that we can do in order to attract immigrants back again?
Well, we're not doing anything wrong. The boom and the bust of the immigration story really has to do with Mexico, because the number of immigrants from the rest of the world through the regular legal immigration system that we have, those numbers are basically the same as they've been for a long time. Those numbers are fixed by Congress. They don't change that much. Chicago has this special relationship with Mexico that goes back many, many decades, and it really took off in combination with the housing bubble and the economic bubble, the stock market run-up of a couple of decades ago, to create a lot of kind of lower-skilled jobs, and we just don't have that right now. And the reason that we don't have Mexicans coming to Chicago is really because they're not coming to the United States. It's not something Chicago did. The net flow of undocumented immigrants from Mexico, it used to be a positive 500,000 a year, by the way, it was. It's zero. You would never hear that from Donald Trump. It's zero. As many Mexicans leave the country as come in right now. Undocumented immigration, everybody, just trust me on this, it's a dead issue. I mean, half the voters think it's not, but it doesn't exist anymore. You with me on that? And that's not Chicago's fault or something that we have control over.
So let's open that more broadly. I mean, what can be done to increase other populations? I mean, for instance, the African American population in Chicago. What can we do to arrest the decline and to attract African Americans back to Chicago in the way that they once were? Or other groups? Anybody?
Well, I'll chime in one thing here, which is the city's doing a pretty good job of attracting a certain group, which is that we hold our own compared to other cities, compared to other metro areas. We hold our own in the number of college-educated young people who move here every year, right? Because there is opportunity. So the city is reflecting the national trend that there's something like 20% of the population doing pretty well. Really, that is the story of the United States, and it's the story of Chicago. And the opportunities for the remaining 80% have not been looking that good for a long time, right? There's a lot of economic evidence of that, the wages, the falling apart, et cetera. But on the attraction of the city for the young and skilled, that's a Chicago success story.
So anybody else?
Well, Jim Dispenza knows this better than maybe anyone in the room, but I think a big divide comes down to how people experience their access to quality public schools. That showed up in the poll as well, and shows up in, we have a visual on our one of our posts that shows the highest ranking neighborhood schools that are majority clustered on the north side. So I think one thing that goes with that is there's a price tag for certainty. If you want certainty that your child can attend what you consider a high-performing or a quality neighborhood school, then you have to live within the boundaries of one, and that carries a high real estate. I talked earlier about bold ideas. I mean, there are places that have done very bold things around a regional desegregation plan for schools. I think it's time to start that level of bold conversation.
Well, so I mean, what role does public education play then in population growth or decline? Is it the major thing, or is it is in terms of different issues? Do you have any idea how it ranks?
I know that in the poll that was taken, the experience of how people rated their local public school varied vastly based on whether they lived on the south side or the north side of Chicago.
So is public education a deciding factor? If you have poor public education, people are moving. Is that still the case? Are people leaving Chicago because they feel like they're not getting good public education, or do people feel like they have a chance?
I would chime in. Oh, I don't have control of the microphone to chime in. I would chime in that, of course, people care about education and their children's access to good education, right? But the correlation isn't always as strong as you think it is, because New Trier Township is in population decline, right? Just as a counterfactual. Pick me a township, a suburb or a township that are among the highest performing schools in the country. So that they're in population decline in Illinois. So there's more than just the school quality, even though, of course, school quality means everything to a parent, right?
Okay. Are there ways that we can, are there specific, so education is one. What are some of the other specific things that we can be doing in order to arrest decline or attract people back to the city, other than jobs? Richard?
Well, I don't have the answer, but just fundamentally, I think that we have to engage at an early age and invest and support in our young populations from troubled neighborhoods. I think we have to show them a way and give opportunities and have open doors and have new ways to communicate. I think that's fundamental. What we see, if people believe in the cities that they live in, believe they can do something with their life and can do it, then that turns it around. I don't think it's necessarily a black or white, Hispanic, poor, rich. There has to be that spirit and that infrastructure of support.
Okay, well, I want to just, we're just about finished, and I want to ask one last question, which is, I want each of you to give me the prognostication, or are we at a precipice? Is there something that is, are we in danger of more bad things happening, or are there good things? I know, Richard, you said a little bit about that, but if you can expand a little bit. Marisa, if you can start first. Are we heading towards a positive or a negative, and what can we do to affect that?
I think this is a critical time, and as I noted previously, I think, we created much of the situation that we're in. Now, a lot of this has to do, we see major population loss in places that also had major manufacturing employment loss. That's not a coincidence, right? So a lot of these things are about bigger global trends. But to the degree that there are things we did here locally, that is legion, and there are things that we can do here locally much differently and much stronger. So to me, I'd say, let's take this moment of a confluence of negatives, and wouldn't be hyperbole to say this is a crisis time for Chicago, and I think let's take that and be bold.
Okay. Richard?
Well, I've been fairly rosy, but let me get real about this. I think cities are living, breathing, organisms and people, and we evolve, and we know what happens in evolution. So the fight to figure out these questions, the fight to take us to the next level is exactly that. It's a fight. It's doing the hard work. It's making it happen. So I feel very encouraged. There's strong market demand. We're asking ourselves how to change the development framework in the core of our city. We're investing in next generation transportation. We haven't even mentioned the amazing wealth of centrally located transportation we have that makes Chicago great. So we have this great foundation. We have strong demand. We know we have problems or challenges to take on, but I think we have the tools to do that. And we haven't really said much about the environment, but I think the huge international discussion has to do with stewardship of the earth. And okay, that sounds heady, but when you think, the Great Lakes right outside the door here, we have 84% of the United States fresh water, 21% of the world's fresh water, what we're doing with that. I feel that we're very focused on today's solutions and today issues and solutions, but there's, a far kind of bigger future wave in terms of humanity and how we're going to be viewed in the United States, and our relevance will grow.
All right, and Rob?
I don't see us being at a precipice or about to fall off a cliff in any way. And one thing that really turns me off and bugs me is in some of the news media, this like, we're going to become Detroit. You could only say that if you have no clue how much more diversified this city is. So, all right, we're gonna take a vow today. We're gonna make a hashtag. Stop talking about Detroit if you live in Chicago.
It's a good thing Twitter's no longer 140 characters.
It's not comparable. The international corporations, the transportation, the things it was blessed with to begin with, its location and transportation. So it's not going to be like Detroit. And then the only other thing I wanted to share with you in the realm of wackiness, but I just think it's kind of real, is that, come on, any one of you who picks up some serious literature and reads about the next few decades in Miami or any coastal city, right? None of us can predict exactly, but New York Harbor is in like really bad shape from everything you read from any reputable scientist, right? Does anyone really disagree with me here? Again, Trump would disagree with me, but right? The global warming change is a big deal. So we can't predict how that's going to play out here, but we're not vulnerable to that, are we? So I don't see us being at a precipice, no. I don't see us growing by 10% either. I think we're going to kind of plateau with our population here, and I'm good with that.
Okay, well, I want to thank Marisa Novara, Richard Wilson, and Rob Paral. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please? This is a fantastic discussion. We are going to take a 15-minute intermission, and then we're going to come back with our next panel, What's Chicago Politics Going to Be Like in 2019? Get a drink, come on back. Don't be gone too long. Thank you very much.